How did a supposedly primitive century leave behind cities that modern engineers struggle to explain? We are told the 1800s were slow, local, limited, horse traffic, hand tools, candlelight. And yet, the streets remain, perfectly graded avenues that still drain rainwater 100 years later, canals that hold their level across miles without visible error, buildings aligned not casually, but with intention. Not improvised, not experimental, complete. I didn't begin by searching for a lost civilization. I began with photographs, glass plates from the mid-1800s, streets already organized, rail systems already embedded, stone facades already weathered as if they had stood longer than the dates suggest. There is something unsettling in those images, not what they show, but what they do not explain. We are taught that daily life in that period was harsh, crude, transitional. But the physical world left behind tells a quieter story. Ceilings rising 16 feet above polished floors, windows tall enough to flood entire rooms with measured light, ornamentation repeated with mathematical precision across continents, not similar, identical. Craft traditions do not scatter symmetry by accident. They follow pattern, memory, instruction, and yet the record insists these structures emerged independently, built by isolated contractors, in disconnected nations, all arriving at the same solutions. Pause there. Consider the paradox. If society was fragmented, how did its architecture speak a single language? Walk through any preserved district today. Notice the stonework. The arches distribute weight as if the builders understood forces without calculation. The streets radiate from central points with geometry visible only from above. The underground chambers extend deeper than simple storage would require. This was not temporary thinking. This was systems thinking. But where is the documentation of its learning? Where are the decades of failure before perfection? Innovation leaves scars. Experimentation leaves mistakes. Yet these systems appear finished. When I began measuring proportions rather than admiring facades, a pattern emerged. Ratios repeated across cities thousands of miles apart. Window placements aligned with seasonal light. Ventilation corridors positioned as though airflow itself had been mapped long before mechanical fans. This was knowledge expressed in stone, not theoretical, embodied. And the more I observed, the less the official narrative seemed sufficient. We are told progress moves forward, from crude to refined, from ignorance to mastery. But what if mastery preceded what we call progress? What if the inheritance was mistaken for invention? I'm not asking whether a name, Tartaria or otherwise, fits the evidence. I'm asking a simpler question. What did daily life look like inside a world capable of building this? Who woke beneath those ceilings? Who walked those streets at dawn? Who maintained the canals that still flow with silent discipline? The contradiction stands. Primitive story. Sophisticated remains, and in the quiet space between them, doubt begins. Imagine morning in a city that official history calls early industrial. Not romantic, not painted in warm nostalgia, just practical life. The kind of life that leaves wear marks on stone steps, soot in old vents, finger-smoothed banisters. You wake before the streets fully stir. The room is tall, too tall. Not the height of vanity, the height of design. 14 feet, sometimes more. A space that changes how sound behaves, how heat rises, how air moves. In a low-ceiling house, breath gathers. Smoke clings. Moisture rots wood. But here, the ceiling grants distance. A slow settling of warmth, a gentle lift of stale air away from the body. You stand near a window that is not merely a window. It is a vertical gate for light, tall enough to throw illumination deep into the room without lamps, set high enough to catch the early angle of the sun, paired often with another opening across the space. not random, aligned. The old builders did not speak in our terms. They did not need to. They worked with what they could observe: wind, season, humidity, the way fog behaves over river streets, the way heat pools in narrow alleys. They built as if the city itself were a living instrument. And the walls. You notice what modern eyes call decoration. Crown molding that is not just pretty, but continuous. Patterns that repeat like measured song. Geometric borders placed at consistent heights, consistent distances, as though the interior was calibrated. The plaster flows like frozen water, not sloppy handwork, not hurried. It takes time to create that kind of surface, and time costs money. So the first question enters quietly. Who paid for this? Not for a palace, for ordinary apartments, for civic buildings used daily. You dress, the photographs show it clearly. Layered garments, structured coats, buttons in rows, hats shaped with discipline. Textiles that do not look like improvised cloth. They look like production. They look like supply, and not only in capital cities. Provincial towns, far from ports, display the same wardrobes, the same fabrics, the same cuts. Cotton, wool, silk, materials that came from far away and came regularly. If everything moved by wagon and horse alone, then the rhythm should be uneven. Some years abundant, some years thin. But the record of clothing, of goods, of household items suggests a steadiness, a dependable flow, as if the city was connected to a wider body. You step into a stairwell, stone treads worn in the center by thousands of feet. There are stairs like this in many places. What matters is the scale, the width, the rise, the way it anticipates crowds. A stair built for one family is narrow. A stair built for a public life is generous. And that generosity appears again and again. Down the hall, you pass doors that are tall enough to admit furniture without turning it sideways, tall enough to make small men feel smaller. Why build like that? A builder working with limited labor avoids excess. He lowers ceilings. He reduces spans. He saves material. Yet here, excess is the default, and that excess is consistent. Not an exception, a pattern. You reach the street. The air is cooler here than it should be, because the street is wide, because the buildings are set back, because the avenues allow wind to move like water between walls. The city breathes. And the street beneath your feet is not a simple road. It is layered, stone, gravel, hidden channels, a slight crown to shed rain, a subtle slope that leads water toward drains positioned at intervals that feel measured. Drainage is not glamour. Drainage is care. It implies planning. And planning implies an authority that thinks beyond the day, beyond the season. You watch early movement. Carts begin to roll, but they roll in lanes, not perfectly marked perhaps, but guided by the street's shape, by curbs, by the width set for flow. A street made for wandering looks different. This one looks made for circulation. And then you notice the rails, sometimes visible, sometimes buried beneath later paving. Lines that do not belong to horses alone. Lines that belong to a schedule, a promise. Because rails imply destinations, fixed routes, stops, a system. And systems are the first thing the official story avoids. It can explain a clever inventor. It can explain a hard-working mason. But it struggles to explain coordinated repetition. Across cities, across nations, across continents. You keep walking. You pass a public building. Its columns rise like an announcement, not of wealth alone, of permanence. And permanence is a strange choice for a transitional age. Why build for centuries if you believed you were only beginning? Why carve stone as if you expected someone far in the future to still be using the room? The questions begin to stack, quietly, not like accusations, like arithmetic. If the city is built as a system, then daily life is not isolated. It is synchronized. And if daily life is synchronized, then something is missing from what we have been told. Not a single secret, not a single dramatic revelation, just an absence, an empty space in the record where explanation should be. And once you feel that emptiness, you start looking for it everywhere. Follow the street farther. It does not end in confusion. It opens. Grand boulevards radiate from central squares as if drawn by compass rather than convenience. From above, the geometry reveals itself. Star patterns, radial symmetry, long sightlines that converge with quiet authority, no medieval tangle, no organic sprawl, but alignment. To align a city requires foresight. To maintain alignment requires governance, and governance leaves records. Yet when you search for the minds behind these plans, you find scattered names, individual architects, local committees, brief mentions, never the scale that matches the result. Consider the rails embedded in those avenues. By the 1860s, streetcars appear in dozens of cities. Not one, not two, dozens. Tracks laid, power systems installed, schedules printed, conductors trained. The official explanation calls it innovation. But innovation is rarely synchronized. Here, the pattern repeats almost simultaneously across continents. Horse-drawn at first, perhaps. Cable systems soon after. Electric traction emerging in multiple regions within a narrow span of years. The infrastructure beneath the surface is even more revealing. Cable conduits, subterranean chambers, machinery pits, ventilation shafts. These are not improvised trenches. They are engineered voids carved deliberately beneath stone. And beneath that, drainage networks. Miles of tunnels large enough for a man to walk upright. Brick archways formed with mathematical patience. Stormwater guided away without visible pumps. How does a primitive society solve fluid dynamics on that scale? Not once. Repeatedly. Travel outward from the city. Follow the canal paths. Some are celebrated in textbooks. Many are not. Narrow waterways linking towns, then widening into arterial routes connecting entire regions. Locks positioned with uncanny precision. Gates that still seal water after a century. Embankments sloped to resist collapse. Reservoir placed at calculated elevations. Water does not tolerate error. If the grade is wrong by inches over miles, it reveals the mistake. Yet the canals hold. They function. They endure. We are told they were built rapidly, in bursts, in short decades, across Britain, across Europe, across North America, thousands of miles, compatible widths, compatible depths, compatible lock dimensions. Compatibility implies standard. Standard implies agreement. Agreement implies communication beyond local boundaries. But the telegraph, we are told, was young. The telephone absent. And yet goods moved with rhythm. Grain from inland fields appearing in coastal markets on schedule. Timber floating downstream toward shipyards waiting for it. Schedules do not tolerate myth. They demand coordination. Pause and imagine the daily worker along these canals. He does not experience abstraction. He experiences routine. Barges arriving at predictable hours. Lock gates opening in measured sequence. Toll houses keeping records in ledgers that assume regular traffic. That routine is invisible to history, because routine feels ordinary, but routine at scale is extraordinary. Shift your gaze farther east, caravan routes crossing deserts, stations placed at intervals matching the endurance of animals, water sources protected by architecture, courtyards designed to shelter hundreds, walls thick enough to moderate temperature swings. These caravanserais appear across vast territories with striking similarity. Not decorative similarity, functional similarity. Built to specification. as if someone understood the rhythm of long-distance movement and codified it into stone. Trade goods flowed through these arteries: silk, spices, metals, ceramics, not occasionally, regularly. And regularity is the quiet sign of system. You cannot move valuable goods across continents without trust, without accounting, without shared measures. Coins change shape across borders, yet bills of exchange are honored. Contracts are enforced, insurance is written, all before electronic communication, all before what we consider modern finance. So how did a merchant in one port trust a signature from another empire? There are answers in fragments. Guilds, correspondence networks, reputation carried by letter. But the speed of synchronization feels accelerated. Architectural styles bloom almost simultaneously in distant cities. Music spreads with uncanny pace. Scientific discoveries announced in multiple capitals within weeks. We accept this as coincidence, or as the romance of the age. But look at the timeline. The intervals are short, suspiciously short. And then there are the exhibitions, the world's fairs, temporary cities erected with astonishing speed. Glass and iron spanning spaces larger than cathedrals. International participation coordinated without digital calendars. Machinery transported from across oceans. Structures assembled, displayed, then dismantled. As if the expertise were ready and waiting. Where did that readiness come from? Why does the learning curve never appear? You stand again in the city at dusk. Gas lamps ignite in rows. Pressure regulated across miles of buried pipe. Water flows indoors with consistency. Heating systems hum behind walls. These are not prototypes. They are operational. They serve entire populations, and they do so without visible hesitation. It is not a single invention that unsettles the narrative. It is the simultaneity, the repetition, the completeness. Across regions separated by language and politics, across cultures said to be only beginning to industrialize. If daily life depended on these systems, and it clearly did, then daily life was embedded within coordination far deeper than the textbooks admit. The question is no longer whether sophistication existed. It did. The question is how it emerged so fully formed, and why the record grows quiet precisely where explanation should begin. Silence, sometimes, is louder than evidence. And in that silence, the shape of something forgotten begins to take form. Return indoors, not to a palace, to an ordinary residence, a row house, an apartment above a shop. A modest civic building repurposed over time. Descend the stairs beneath it. The basement extends deeper than storage requires. Brick arches support ceilings that feel almost ceremonial. Chambers branch into secondary rooms. Drains cut into floors with intention. Iron brackets mounted in walls for equipment no longer present. These spaces are labeled simply cellar, but the engineering feels excessive for root vegetables and coal. Walls thick enough to resist pressure. Openings sealed with heavy doors. Pipe connections leading outward in multiple directions. If this was only storage, why the symmetry? Why the redundancy? Climb back to the main level. Observe the walls. They are not thin partitions. They are cavities, wide enough to conceal vertical shafts running floor to floor. Ventilation channels, service corridors for unseen systems. Some are now empty, others bricked over. When buildings are renovated, workers occasionally uncover networks they do not understand. Pipes that no longer connect to visible sources. Conduits that terminate in sealed chambers. The explanation offered is always simple. Obsolete utilities, outdated heating, forgotten plumbing. But the scale remains disproportionate, too integrated, too deliberate. Move upward. Notice how ceilings gradually lower as you ascend. Ground floors grand, upper levels restrained. Was this merely aesthetic? Or did air circulate according to a principle we no longer practice? Look toward the roofline. Small structures sit atop many buildings. Cupolas, observation rooms, platforms with clear views in multiple directions. Some align with cardinal points, others with prominent landmarks. Official history calls them decorative, but decoration does not require alignment. Alignment implies purpose. Now consider the factory floor. We are shown images of early industry as rough and transitional. Yet photographs from the 1840s and 1850s display vast halls filled with machinery arranged in orderly rows, belts turning in synchronized rhythm, shafts transmitting power from centralized sources, iron frames supporting multi-story equipment, precision metalworking tools capable of tolerances difficult even today. Interchangeable parts appear in records far earlier than expected. Standardized gauges, uniform threads, components manufactured in different cities fitting together without alteration. Standardization is not accidental. It is agreed upon. It is enforced. Workers in these factories do not appear bewildered. They operate with fluency. Training must have preceded deployment. But where are the decades of apprenticeship that built such widespread expertise? Industrial revolutions, we are told, begin with experimentation. But the evidence often shows immediate scale. Textile mills producing immense quantities within years of founding, steel foundries operating at capacity shortly after construction. Chemical works synthesizing compounds with sophisticated control. Inherited knowledge feels more plausible than spontaneous mastery. Yet inheritance requires a lineage, and that lineage grows faint in the archives. Daily commerce adds another layer. Markets function with predictable pricing across oceans. Grain futures traded with awareness of distant harvests. Tea arriving in London with remarkable punctuality. Cotton crossing the Atlantic and returning as finished cloth within months. Credit instruments honored across empires. Letters of exchange accepted without electronic verification. Trust at that scale implies institutional memory, an unseen architecture of agreement, guilds, societies, associations. Professional orders linking engineers, merchants, and administrators across borders. Their records are sparse, but their influence is visible in uniform outcomes. Identical building codes, shared engineering practices, coordinated responses to challenges. It is as if parallel structures of authority operated quietly alongside official governments, not secret, simply assumed, taken for granted by those who lived within them. Then, something shifts. By the early 20th century, journals begin to change tone. Discussions of hydraulic systems diminish. Integrated urban planning yields to segmented departments, holistic design fragments into specialties. The language narrows. The systems become compartmentalized, and with compartmentalization comes amnesia. When knowledge is divided, the larger pattern fades. What was once intuitive coordination becomes technical expertise confined to silos. The city still stands, but its meaning begins to blur. Older residents speak of services that once functioned seamlessly: water clearer, streets cleaner, infrastructure requiring less visible repair. Their recollections are dismissed as nostalgia. Yet physical remnants support their claims. Railway stations built with acoustic properties, modern designers struggle to reproduce. Waterworks maintaining pressure without constant mechanical assistance. Industrial buildings regulating climate through passive design rather than active machinery. The evidence is tangible. Stone, iron, brick, water still flowing through 19th century channels. The contradiction grows sharper. If progress is linear, why do we struggle to match what was once routine? If knowledge only accumulates, why do certain capacities appear lost? This is not a dramatic collapse, not catastrophe, but erosion, a quiet replacement, one paradigm yielding to another. And within a generation, the memory of how systems once integrated disappears. We inherit the structures, but not the understanding. We renovate the buildings, but not the logic. We pave over rails, but not the alignment beneath them. The question begins to press harder, Not whether sophistication existed, but what daily life felt like as that sophistication receded. What does it mean to live inside systems you do not fully comprehend? To maintain infrastructure whose original principles are forgotten? To explain inherited mastery as if you invented it? The buildings do not argue. They endure. And in their endurance, they whisper a different story. One not loudly proclaimed, simply present, waiting. As daylight fades, the city does not retreat into darkness. It awakens again. Rows of lamps ignite along the avenues, not scattered oil flames trembling in the wind, but ordered illumination, evenly spaced, measured. Gas flowing through buried arteries beneath the pavement, pressure regulated across miles of unseen pipe, valves adjusted with precision. Entire districts lit at once. To distribute combustible gas safely through a city requires confidence. Surveying, maintenance crews, monitoring. It requires institutional continuity. And yet by the mid-1800s, such systems are already mature in many urban centers. Not experimental, not tentative, operational. Water moves the same way. Reservoirs positioned at elevations calculated to provide steady pressure. Aqueducts spanning valleys. Filtration houses designed with quiet intelligence. Taps in homes delivering reliable flow. Sanitation managed through underground tunnels vast enough for a man to stand upright. Storm drains aligned with subtle gradients so exact they still function today. This is not improvisation. It is foresight expressed in stone and brick. Now ask a quieter question. How did ordinary households afford access to this? Infrastructure of this scale demands enormous capital, continuous oversight, skilled labor. Yet middle-class neighborhoods were connected, served, integrated. The economics feel incomplete, unless something about organization differs from what we assume. Look upward again at the night skyline. Windows glow behind tall panes, some powered by gas, some, later, by arc lighting systems that require delicate regulation. Photographs from the era show public squares illuminated for evening gatherings, theaters open after sunset, shops operating beyond dusk. Such activity implies confidence in power sources, confidence in maintenance, confidence in supply chains. The official narrative describes electrical experimentation as fragile and limited, yet urban deployment appears decisive, complete. And then, another quiet shift. By the early 20th century, many of these integrated systems are replaced, canals abandoned for rail adjusted to new gauges, gas plants dismantled in favor of centralized grids, architectural ornaments simplified, ceilings lowered, windows reduced. Standardization takes a new form, functional, efficient, but less harmonious. The city's rhythm changes, not violently, gradually. Specialists replace generalists. Engineers focus narrowly. Departments divide responsibilities. The holistic understanding that once unified street, water, air, and light dissolves into compartments. And within a generation, the memory of integration fades. When a basement chamber is discovered during renovation, it is labeled obsolete. When a rooftop platform is found aligned with cardinal points, it is dismissed as decorative flourish. When an old canal still drains a district better than modern pipes, it is called coincidence. But coincidence does not repeat with such discipline. Walk today through an untouched 19th century district. Notice the weight of doors, the proportion of halls, the subtle geometry in brick patterns. These are not accidents of taste. They are expressions of a worldview that saw the city as organism rather than machine, as coordinated whole rather than collection of parts. And that worldview leaves traces. In acoustic railway halls, where a single voice carries clearly without amplification. In courtyards that regulate temperature through nothing more than proportion. In facades aligned to greet the sun at predictable angles across seasons. The evidence is not hidden. It is simply unremarked upon, because acknowledging it unsettles a comforting story. The story that everything before us was incomplete, that we alone perfected the system. But what if we inherited more than we admit? What if we simplified what was once integrated? What if daily life in that era moved within networks more coherent than our own? These questions are not accusations. They are observations. The buildings stand. The canals still hold water. The rail alignments remain visible from the air. What was coordinated once can still be traced. And as we trace it, a pattern emerges, not of myth, not of fantasy, but of sophistication whose documentation thins precisely where explanation should deepen. Something changed, not abruptly, but persistently. And in that persistence, knowledge eroded. What daily life felt like during that erosion, that is the question that lingers now. Stand again at the edge of the present. Look backward without romance, without accusation. Simply observe. The 19th century left behind more than photographs. It left behind proportion, alignment, infrastructure that continues to function long after its builders had been forgotten. We are told progress is linear, from candle to filament, from canal to rail, from stone to steel. Yet when you measure endurance, the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Railway stations whose acoustics require no electronic enhancement, water systems whose pressure regulation operates without constant recalibration, brick tunnels that have outlived the departments assigned to maintain them. What does it mean when inheritance outperforms innovation? This is not nostalgia. It is contrast. Ancient permanence. Modern fragility. Walk through a city renovated beyond recognition and you feel disorientation. Glass facades replaced carved stone. Ceilings lowered to conserve energy. Windows narrowed to reduce heat loss. Efficiency improved. Perhaps. But coherence diminished. The earlier worldview, whatever its name, treated the city as a whole. Street, canal, market, dwelling, and hall integrated into a single rhythm. Light entered with intention. Air circulated through proportion. Movement flowed along axes drawn long before automobiles existed. Daily life within such a system would have felt different. Not frantic, structured, predictable. Markets opening with synchronized supply. Transport arriving at expected intervals. Public spaces designed for gathering rather than passage. People lived inside coordination. They did not need to see its blueprint. They trusted it. And then, quietly, trust shifted. Departments replaced guild memory. Specialization replaced integration. Systems became technical rather than cultural. And once knowledge is divided, its original unity is difficult to recall. Within 2 generations, explanation thins. Within 3, the narrative hardens. We look at inherited mastery and call it primitive. We examine integrated design and label it ornamental. We reduce what remains to anecdote. But stone resists revision. Water remembers its channels. Rail lines preserve their alignment long after tracks are removed. The question is no longer whether sophistication existed. The evidence stands. The question is, why acknowledging it unsettles us? Why must the past be smaller than the present? Why must we insist that knowledge only accumulates? Civilizations forget. Craft traditions fade. Memory dissolves when not practiced. Perhaps no single event erased anything. Perhaps erosion alone was sufficient. A shift in priorities, a change in worldview, an impatience with inherited wisdom. And in that impatience, integration gave way to fragmentation. If you walk carefully, you can still feel the earlier rhythm beneath your feet, in the slope of an old avenue, in the curve of a canal wall, in the proportion of a hall built to resonate with human voice. Daily life in that world may not have been perfect, but it was coordinated, sophisticated in ways that do not fit our simplified story. Something was known. something practiced widely, something embedded in craft rather than textbooks. And it diminished, gradually enough that few noticed, completely enough that most now deny it. The buildings do not argue. They endure. The infrastructure does not speak. It functions. And the photographs preserve faces of people who move through systems we no longer fully comprehend. Once you notice the discrepancy between narrative and stone, it is difficult to ignore. Not because it proves a hidden empire, not because it demands dramatic revision, but because it reveals absence. An absence of explanation, an absence of curiosity, an absence of humility before what came before us. What else have we forgotten? What other knowledge rests quietly in plain sight? The archives remain deep. The streets remain aligned. The canals still carry water. And the questions remain. Whether we choose to ask them, that is the only decision left.